but there's a dizzying array of other agenda items, and you talked about a few of them. Certainly, China is going to deliver a message about Taiwan. The U.S. is going to deliver a message about human rights. Ukraine is certainly on the agenda. The U.S. wants to make sure that China stays on the sidelines of the Ukraine conflict and really wants to try to convince China not to support Russia, not to provide lethal weapons to Russia. And that may be one of the biggest short-term priorities for the Secretary of State.
There's so many threads that I want to pull with what you just said here. Let's start with when you mentioned about our militaries, because there have been some pretty dangerous encounters between our two militaries, particularly at sea and in the air. Is that expected to come up? Do you think it will be addressed?
My understanding is that it will be addressed. Again, it will be addressed in the context of how do we avoid an accidental confrontation between our two militaries? How do we have a direct line of communication between the Pentagon and between the Chinese military in order to deconflict where we are operating close to each other?
Mm-hmm. And when you mentioned Taiwan, do you think that there will be headway when talking about Taiwan?
It's hard to imagine there will be much headway because we disagree as two countries about Taiwan. China very much wants Taiwan to be part of mainland China again, even though it has never ruled Taiwan, and Taiwan is a self-governing democracy. And the U.S. wants Taiwan to remain that way, and the U.S. is supporting Taiwan, and we have a very specific strategy and policy towards Taiwan, and Secretary Blinken is going to maintain that during these discussions.
China hasn't provided lethal aid to Russia for the war in Ukraine, turning to Ukraine now so far, but are there concerns that could change?
That is a major current concern of the administration, in my view. China is reportedly providing some non-lethal equipment. Even vehicles that have been supplied by China have made their way to the battlefield on behalf of the Russian forces. So far as we know publicly, China has not provided weapons and lethal support, but the U.S. is very worried about the possibility that China would, and so Secretary Blinken is going to raise that, in my expectation, and he's going to try to come up with some inducements for China not to do that.
Okay, and the other thing we needed to talk about, going back actually to Taiwan, there was regarding the semiconductor chips and manufacturing here in the Biden administration banned exports of these products and equipment to China. So how do you think that that's going to be addressed, if it will be as well?
Well, that's certainly problematic for China, right? It's an important part of their export industry. It's an important part of the way for China to continue to develop is that there's a market for their chips and for their sophisticated equipment and electronics that they make. But there's, the U.S. has national security interests at stake. We don't want to share technology with China. We don't want China ripping off our technology. We don't want China being able to replicate our weapon systems. And so my expectation is that that is not going to change. If anything, there are going to be more restrictions in the future put in place with bipartisan support in Washington.
Something we haven't mentioned so far in our conversation, this trip was originally planned for February, and then it was postponed, after the discovery and shoot down of the Chinese spy balloon. Is the visit an indication that that has been resolved in some way here?
Well, remember, Secretary Blinken really wanted to do that visit, and of course he had to call it off because the timing was so poor, because it happened just around the time when it was publicly exposed that there were these Chinese spy balloons. My expectation is that will be also part of the conversation, but there have also been, behind the scenes discussions with China about that, and a very strong message was sent by the U.S. to China not to be going over our airspace without permission.
So we've got this litany of topics that need to be addressed during this meeting. I know you mentioned Ukraine, in your view, is really at the top of that discussion, but from Antony Blinken's perspective, what do you think is the #1 priority that he wants to get across before returning to London after that meeting?
I think the first one is that he wants to restart communications and discussions. There are a number of reasons for that. One, to deconflict our militaries in case of an accidental confrontation between them. But also, he wants potentially in the future for there to be more evolved discussions about cooperation with China, about perhaps some sort of nuclear deal, because one of the things the U.S. is also worried about is that China has a very ambitious plan to increase its nuclear arsenal. So we'd ultimately like to have some nuclear talks with China about limiting the amount of nuclear weapons that they and we are producing.
Okay, David Tafuri, thank you so much.